Hello and welcome to Faith in Action, a podcast from the Christian Institute. Thank you for joining us. Today I'm joined by our very hardworking education team. We have our education officers, Alison Bowie, David Bromley, and we have our head of education, John Denning, whom many of you will have seen before if you ever tune into our Friday news videos. Incidentally, if you're interested in getting our Friday news videos, you can just sign up via the.ci/sign up, and we will send you updates on what's going on, how you can get involved with that, and our weekly news video as well. So do sign up to that. Now, there is absolutely loads going on in the world of education right now. And so, firstly, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to come along and talk to me. But before we get to any of that, people will know John a little bit. But why don't you, Alison and David, just talk through who you are, what are your credentials?
Okay, well, I'm Alison Bowie, and I spent around 14 happy, idyllic, rose-tinted years home educating my 3 children, or so it seems now. They are now young adults navigating the world of work. And before that, I was a health services researcher up in Aberdeen and also in Newcastle. Interestingly, 2 of our children are now teachers and one of them's a nurse. So they obviously kept the education health theme going. I joined the CI in 2021.
Not in education, though.
No, first in the research department, and then I joined the education department in 2024.
And David?
So I've been a teacher for 18 years, I think. I didn't go straight into teaching. I worked in a variety of kind of residential roles, including working with ex-offenders and young adults, and that led me into teaching because I was dealing with a lot of literacy issues and things that really should have been addressed at school. Qualified as an RE secondary specialist teacher. Spent a year doing special educational needs. Taught history for many years. Have taught international. Have taught in a variety of schools. And then up until last year, I joined the Christian Institute as education officer after working in a local school.
And John, some people will have seen you a lot but don't necessarily know who you are. But you were the first person to join the education department, as it were. How did all that come about?
Well, it's actually a very long story how I came to work here. But yeah, I used to be a teacher as well, secondary school teacher, taught biology. I was head of science at a new school that opened up in Northumberland. So yes, got involved in that, and then came here to work specifically on education.
So, can you guys just give some kind of broad, sweeping overview of what the education department does? Kind of, what are the aims, and then what's the kind of day-to-day look like?
So I suppose there's 2 aspects to it, really. One is giving help and support to individual teachers and parents, school governors or others who are having something to do with the education system and they're coming up against a problem. Maybe a teacher has been asked to teach something that they just feel in good conscience they can't teach, or not at least not in the way they're being told to teach it. Or it could be a school governor. It could be parents who are concerned about what their child is learning in school and they're wanting advice on their particular situation. As I say, it could be a problem or it could be an opportunity. So it could be say a Christian school and it's wanting to do a really good and thoroughly Christian job of its approach to, say, fulfilling the requirements in England for relationships and sex education. And so they're wanting to discuss their policy. Or it could be a group that's wanting to set up a Christian school. So there's that side of the work, which is more sort of individual advice. And then also we're trying, like the rest of the CI, to encourage Christians to make their voice heard, to have an influence on policy, public policy, on education issues. And then on the back of that, we're sometimes getting meetings ourselves with civil servants and politicians about education issues.
How does that kind of work if parents or teachers are trying to make an impact in their schools? Like, what does that look like?
Well, we spend a lot of time looking at guidance and trying to be able to convey that guidance so that it's user-friendly for parents or teachers, so that they can look at what guidance might say, how it sort of impacts schools or how schools should be responding to it, and trying to give them just advice on how to make an impact and how to approach schools. I think would be one way that we try to make things work.
Yeah, I mean, it's often the case that, we tend to always be worried about how, there's this law that we don't like, there's this guidance that we don't like, and well, that may be true, and there's certainly things that if you had your way, you'd want to change and improve. But a lot of the time, actually, there's quite a bit in the law and in official guidance from government that's actually helpful, and which Christians can make use of. And a lot of the problem is actually where schools are departing from what they're meant to be doing. So just equipping people with knowing what their rights are, knowing what actually schools are meant to be doing, can be really helpful.
So you're trying really to get parents to kind of engage in a constructive way, kind of building relationships with schools rather than that kind of combative thing that that combative attitude that maybe you see in the papers from time to time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if things kind of go to that point of being combative, that's obviously not in the best interests of the child. Now, there are situations, I think, where you find schools, maybe where the head teacher is a real activist for causes to which Christians have no choice but to oppose, and which they don't want shaping the education of their child, where the only course that the parent can take is to put in a formal complaint. But that's the last resort. The first step is trying to help the school to understand the parent's concerns, and to engage in that in a positive, constructive way that will benefit not only those parents' child, but all the children at the school, by helping the school to have a wiser, more balanced approach, and just to understand the issues and the concerns better.
I think some supporters are maybe surprised that we take that view of being positive and constructive, but it just really helps relationships between parents and schools if you take that approach. It's amazing what I'm sure there's a Bible verse about that. A soft answer turns away wrath. That one. If you're going to come to a school and they're all day teaching your children, then it's good to be constructive if you can be. I think that's the view we take, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think obviously with parents or teachers, if you have a positive relationship with the school because you're contributing, and then you're much more likely to be listened to when maybe an issue arises. So I think encouraging Christian parents, teachers, governors to be involved, and local churches as well, if they can be involved in the school, then that really sort of does help, as it were, prepare the ground for when there might be more serious concerns. So.
Okay, so you mentioned before that you have some of the problems that you're kind of coming up against, and then there are some opportunities that you have as well. Can you give examples of some of the contact that we're getting from supporters? What are some of the things that are kind of coming up quite a bit?
So if we have something in the news that piques people's interest, then often we'll get a lot of feedback or questions about that. So, for example, recently we had the Supreme Court ruling in Northern Ireland about RE, and therefore there was a lot of inquiries and concerns about that. And a lot of our feedback was really just sort of assuaging their concerns that there wasn't so much to worry about. But if we were talking about themes, then the whole issue of relationships and sexual health or sex and health education has different names in every single one of the nations and Ireland. So we're often getting inquiries about the content of what's being taught, which is often still quite shocking to many parents when they realise what's being taught to their children. Often it can, with children being left anxious about what they've learnt. For us, it's not so shocking because we deal with it all the time. But for parents, I think that's one of the significant themes. Also, I think recently we've had a few inquiries where it's been about how to address teachers or Christian teachers worrying about how to address students or pupils with regard to the whole issue of transgender ideology, where where a Christian student wants to address their teacher respectfully and with integrity, but the teacher is requesting that they go under a title that assumes a different gender identity to their biological sex, and vice versa with teachers who are sometimes feel they're being put under pressure to call a child by a name or use pronouns that are contrary to their biological sex. And so queries along that nature, I'd say have been pretty common as well.
So we have a few questions that supporters have asked us, and I just wanted to throw them out to the three of you now. So firstly, how much scope is there for Christian teachers to push back against ideological teaching that is contrary to the Bible?
Well, no school should be delivering any ideological teaching in that sense. As David's already outlined, that there's all different jurisdictions that we're dealing with here, and education law is different in all of them. What they all have in common is the European Convention on Human Rights, which, by the way, it's unaffected by Brexit, still applies at the moment anyway, throughout the UK and in Ireland, which says that for state education, state schools have to educate in a way that respects parents' religious and philosophical beliefs. And that's achieved by teaching in a manner which is objective and which presents fairly the range of different views there are on a topic. So in that way, if a teacher is teaching a topic, and a Christian teacher, and they're being asked to teach a view with which, as a Christian, they conscientiously disagree, they can always handle that by saying, well, here's one view, and here's another view, and here's another view, and including a Christian view within that, that's perfectly acceptable. And in that way, the teacher is at least avoiding promoting a particular view and has the opportunity to include a Christian view within that. Now, obviously, that's more applicable when you're dealing with older pupils who can engage in that kind of critical analysis of a range of different views. It's going to be more difficult with younger pupils, more difficult sometimes if you're in a special needs school, depending on the kinds of special needs. Although I think we should be ambitious and aim for that sort of critical view. But obviously, if you're dealing with very young children and you're dealing with a topic where there's different viewpoints, and really it would be better if the school was saving that topic until the pupils are older and more mature and more able to consider the different views. So that's one thing. Now, if we were talking specifically about England, specifically about Scotland or whatever, there would be more things that you could say in terms of what the teacher could do. But obviously we had the Ashes case a number of years ago now, actually, that we were involved with, and that established the principle in law that the right to free speech includes a right not to be compelled to promote a view with which you disagree. Now, that was in the context of a bakery making a cake, but it's certainly that the same principle is going to apply to teachers. Courts haven't considered a case involving teachers, but the principle is there. A teacher shouldn't be compelled to promote a viewpoint with which they fundamentally disagree. But that doesn't mean they can just choose not to teach a topic. It's about how it's taught.
Last month was so-called LGBT History Month. Is this something schools have to promote, and what does it involve?
Well, they don't have to promote it at all, as far as I'm aware.
It's not part of any kind of curriculum or...
There are lots of curriculum models that are being promoted which would encourage inclusive LGBT education across every single subject in the curriculum, but it's not a requirement. Often it's tokenistic and distracting and deflecting from the real content of these subjects anyway. I mean, obviously, if it's relevant, I can speak from experience teaching history. When we talked about the Holocaust, it's relevant to talk about the different groups were targeted, and so it comes naturally that you would include gay people in that category because they were targeted. But in other areas, it can seem to be overwhelming a curriculum area where it's not actually relevant or needed. It doesn't actually help with the learning. And, obviously it's important to promote respectful treatment of all people, but it can be forced within curriculum areas. And that's actually an area where we're seeing it more and more. We actually had somebody contacted us referencing, I think it was modern foreign languages, where suddenly there was changes in modern foreign languages with regard to vocabulary lists, where suddenly we've got certain terms that were never included before being included, and even examples that really were just promoting an ideological standpoint that beared no real value from a learning perspective. So these are the things that are forever creeping in to education at the moment. But there's no requirement that you must.
But you've also got a duty to be politically impartial as well. So you've got to be aware of that when you're teaching what is still very controversial subjects, really.
And then final question before we move on to some of the many, many things which are going on across the UK and Ireland at the moment. What is the CI doing to combat some of the awful, awful things which are going on in schools at the moment?
So, for example, the RSHE guidance came out last year. It comes into force in September this year. So this presents an opportunity for parents, teachers, governors to get engaged in the whole policy making and development of an RSHE program. And I would say, to be honest, from my perspective, all schools in England should be reviewing their policies right now. So we have created a webinar that we're hoping to release soon that will hopefully help people and support schools to understand the guidance, to understand the law, to understand its impact, to understand how they can come up with a good RSHE program that has integrity and that really will benefit students and focus on those positives within it. We'll also hopefully be able to publish a booklet form of that guidance. And likewise, we would do similar for each of the nations. So that would be one example.
You also mentioned earlier, John, didn't you, that occasionally we're sort of in contact with civil servants and people in the government. And what does that look like?
Well, it varies. It depends on the issue. Depends on where we're talking about. So it does vary. But yes. So I will email people within the Department for Education, for example. And they will sometimes even reply, and sometimes I'll get a meeting. Or it could be going down to Westminster, meeting with an MP who might share some of our concerns, not necessarily all of them, but they may share a particular concern, and we can help inform them, help them take it forward. It could be that there's some legislation going through Parliament, in which case we'll be contacting politicians, whether that's in Westminster or Northern Ireland or Scotland. We haven't yet done it in Ireland. We will probably do that in the near future. And we're helping those politicians understand the issues. We're providing them with information. We're providing them with evidence, helping them to make the case. Or sometimes we're just trying to persuade them of the case in the first place and persuade them to take our concerns forwards. But that works hand in hand as well with us contacting our supporters on our mailing list. If there's a consultation on guidance, David just mentioned the new relationships, sex and health education guidance in England that came out in July. Well, there was a call for evidence on that. There was a public consultation on that, and we wrote out to our supporters, making suggestions for things they might want to say in response to that consultation. Now we've got the guidance. It's a mix, but it does contain some helpful things. So then David's been working on this webinar to guide schools through it and to try to make the most of those positive things that's there in the guidance.
Well, John, you have been in your role for certainly more than 10 years now. You were the original education officer, but when the CI was set up, it was set up by a former maths teacher with the secondary school headmaster as the chairman. And one of the reasons they wanted to set up the CI was because they thought more Christians needed to be an influence in the world of education. And so there's always been an education focus, hasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. I think I'm right. Alison knows more about this actually because she's been working on the history of the CI. But it was really getting involved in education policy when John and Colin did that initially, that then and had some success there that led them then to set up the Christian Institute.
That's right. I think they got involved with Baroness Caroline Cox, who was campaigning for more Christian input into religious education back in, I think it was 1988, that Colin Hart and John Byrne got involved, and then that led to the setting up of the Christian Institute eventually. So, yeah.
So collective worship, RE teaching, lack of Christian content in schools, these kind of things are still going on today, aren't they? Scotland have just changed the law, or just voted to change the law on religious observance.
Yes. So there is this rather verbosely titled Children's Withdrawal from Religious Education and Amendment of UNCRC Compatibility Duty Scotland Bill that has just recently been voted through the Scottish Parliament by MSPs. And as it stands, there are two big takeaways from that. And one of them is that, in fact, children can now veto their parents in a decision to withdraw them from a religious observance in Scottish schools. So basically, this bill now undermines parental rights. And the other big thing that happened was that there was an amendment proposed during the passage of the bill through the Scottish Parliament that was voted for that actually removes the parental right of withdrawal from religious education, or as they call it in Scotland, religious and moral education, RME. So basically what it's done is removed that helpful conscience clause for parents, which acted in the past as a kind of check for schools to ensure that parental wishes were respected. So that conscience clause has been removed with minimal debate and scrutiny. And that was not the original intent of the bill. It just kind of came up as it was being debated. And all this was in the name of child rights, which in fact is a kind of dangerous misapplication and misinterpretation of the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Child articles. So if anybody took the time to read the articles, the UNCRC articles and the introduction, it consistently presumes that parents are the guardians and protectors of their children's rights. It never, ever envisages that the rights of the child should overrule or undermine the rights of parents. But it seems like the Scottish governments are bent on furthering the rights of the child at the cost of the important God-given role of parents to judge what's in the best interest of their children. And I mean, we can see that it puts excessive burdens on children because we're expecting them to make decisions that they don't really have the maturity to understand. So, yeah, we weren't really expecting this from this bill. It was, but that's what's happened. So it's at the stage where it's awaiting royal assent. But it's been voted through the Scottish Parliament.
How does that pair with what we have in the European Convention on Human Rights about a parent's right to raise their child as they see fit if the parents are now being cut out of the equation?
It does seem somewhat of a clash, doesn't it?
It does. And I think that's part of the thinking behind it, actually. It seems almost quite sinister to me. People talk about child rights. I'm not saying that they're not sincere in believing in the rights of the child, but it's very easy for it to become an excuse for people who think they know better than parents to interfere in parents' decision making, and they justify it under the name of child rights. But it really becomes a pretext for trying to set parents' rights to one side. Now, there is a difference because the European Convention on Human Rights is incorporated into UK law and the Human Rights Act. The UNCRC doesn't have that same status. It does have a higher status in Scotland, although it doesn't actually technically apply to the provision of education by local authorities. So yeah, the legalities of it are quite nuanced, but the rights under the European Convention, as the law stands at the moment, are stronger. And then in Ireland, you've got constitutional protections for parents' rights and acknowledgement of that. And the thinking is that parents are, in almost all situations, in the best place to protect their children's rights. It's not a case of pitting one against the other. It's the reason parents have rights is to empower them to do their job of guarding their child's rights. But what this bill in Scotland does is it tries to pit one against another, and the suspicion is it's because there are politicians who think, I know better than parents, and I want to be able to do this. But it also exposes children to manipulation, to peer pressure, which, given the right to parents, protects them against.
So potentially you've got a situation whereby there's going to be some kind of sex education lesson going on in the school, and a parent doesn't feel as though their child is kind of emotionally ready to hear that teaching. They want to withdraw the child, but the child now has the right to say, no, I'm going to be in that lesson because all my friends are going to be in it, so I don't want to miss out.
Well, we're not there yet. Okay, so what this bill has done only applies to religious and moral education, and it's only a right for a child to opt themselves back in when a parent has withdrawn them.
But
That's
in
right,
fact, because of this amendment, they've actually removed the parental right
That's
of withdrawal for religious and moral education. So it was at the beginning of the bill, it was for religious observance and it was for religious and moral education. But a good way through the passage of the bill through the Scottish Parliament, somebody brought in an amendment to say, no, we don't want a parental right of withdrawal for religious and moral education. So it's simply now for religious observance that this is applying to. But we foresee they might apply it to other subjects, and this seems like the obvious one.
Yeah, it seems like that's where it's going, they might like to try to take it. But as things stand, still the case in Scotland that if a parent wants to withdraw their child from sexual health as part of RSHP education, they can still do that.
Now, education is a world of lots and lots of acronyms. I've got written down here in front of me RSHP guidance. What's RSHP stand for, and what does it mean?
So that's relationships, sexual health, and parenthood education. So this is what you have in Scotland. It's the equivalent of RSE in England or Wales or Northern Ireland. So the parenthood bit, there's not much actually in new guidance on that, but there's this new guidance came out a few weeks ago. So it's guidance for local authorities on the conduct of RSHP. It's statutory guidance, so local authorities in Scotland have to have regard to it. And it's a change from the previous version of the guidance that was published, I think, in 2014. So there's been a number of changes, some for the worse, a few little changes for the better, maybe, along the way. It isn't great guidance. It does, however, continue to say parents can withdraw their child from sexual health element. continues to talk about working in consultation with parents, consulting parents. Its language on that is not as crystal clear as it could be, but the word is still in there. So that there's still an opportunity for parents to say, well, we've got some new RSHP guidance. I noticed that. I was just wondering what the school plans and what the school's plan is for consulting parents, if it's going to be revising its approach to this. It does talk quite a bit about faith, actually, and that's one of the better elements of it. There's a greater acknowledgement that religion and belief does make a difference to how people approach some of the questions that are considered in RSHP, and there's an encouragement of schools to acknowledge that and not to marginalise that. So that's a positive that's there in the guidance.
And what's the situation in Northern Ireland? Because not so long ago there was this big court case, and it was talking about religious education and how much of a Christian element there can be or should be or shouldn't be. And I think it's confused an awful lot of people. So perhaps you can give some clarity on what on earth that was all about and what the end result is.
So in Northern Ireland, the law requires religious education to be based on Holy Scripture. That's the wording that's used in the law. There's a core curriculum for RE that's taught across all schools in Northern Ireland, all state-funded schools, that is, which is based on Holy Scripture. So it's Catholic and Protestant schools, all types of state-funded schools. And that really is because the schools were originally founded by the churches. That's why that's in place. But there were some parents, humanist parents, who objected to this. They found their daughter was coming home wanting to say grace before having snacks, was asserting, oh, God made the world, as if that was a fact, and the parents didn't think that was a fact. So they had the right to withdraw their daughter from religious education and from collective worship. But they didn't want to do that. They felt it would be stigmatizing, and they'd have to disclose their beliefs to the school, and they're worried about the implications of that. And they didn't want to damage their relationship with the school, so they took the school to court and pursued that to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided that the right of withdrawal was theoretical and illusory, because the fact was that very few children get withdrawn. When they were getting withdrawn, a few months later, they were being put back in because it was so difficult for them to be withdrawn. This is at primary school. And so the Supreme Court ruled that really, basically, its decision was a right to withdrawal is not sufficient to protect parents' rights to have their child educated in accordance with their beliefs. So the RE syllabus itself needs to be, that core syllabus needs to contain a broader range of beliefs, fairly presented in an objective way.
So it couldn't be exclusively Christian.
That's right. It couldn't be exclusively Christian. That's right, and it had to give a fair presentation of other beliefs. So the RE curriculum is being revised in Northern Ireland, but the law's not been changed. And this is the really important point to get hold of. The Supreme Court did have the power to quash the laws there in Northern Ireland. It didn't. So the laws remain the same. The religious education is still required to be based on Holy Scripture.
Yes, I think that's one of the things that's confused people, that they see religious education can't be exclusively Christian, and they read it as can't be Christian.
Yeah.
But actually, it's still the case that the majority of the teaching could still be Christian, and that's absolutely fine, and that's lawful. And
Yes, and the Supreme Court specifically said that it's perfectly lawful for the RE syllabus to focus in the main on Christianity, and that reflects, the court said, the fact that that's the most important religion in Northern Ireland is Christianity. So that's completely legitimate, and it needs to continue to be based. That element of it, anyway, needs to continue to be based on the Bible. So, it's completely understandable that Christians in Northern Ireland are upset by this because, after all, these schools were founded by the churches, handed over to the state on the understanding that RE would always be delivered. Well, it was understanding that biblical instruction would always be provided in those schools. And now we have a court case that seems to be changing that. And it is true that court case has an impact. It will require different beliefs to be presented to children, to be taught about. But we can still recognise the importance of the fact that every child in Northern Ireland will still be taught about the Bible. And that's a wonderful thing. And we mustn't sort of end up diluting that or making Christians feel nervous, and particularly Christians in education feel nervous about delivering those Christian elements of the education, because that's required in law.
Let's continue our tour of the British Isles. Should we go down to Wales now? Is there anything particular going on in Wales that ought to be talked about?
Well, of course, we've got the election coming up.
Yeah.
So we're going to have, we're already starting to get the manifestos being produced by the different parties in Wales. They will include proposals on education. So Christians in Wales can certainly be looking at those, and in due course we'll get to canvassing and get some people coming around knocking on doors, trying to canvass for votes for their party, and it's a really good opportunity then to be asking questions and raising issues from a Christian perspective, so that those people know that these actually make a difference to how people vote, and education issues are obviously within that. There have been big concerns about the RSE code that came in as part of Wales's new curriculum starting in 2021. It's just rolled out now. I think it's just rolling out to year 11 now. I think I've got that right. So it'll have gone all the way through now. But that's something that people may like to raise with politicians and their representatives during the election period.
Ireland? Do we have much to say about Ireland? There was a booklet that we produced a little while ago.
That was SPHE, yes. Social, Personal and Health Education. Yes, so that's a new approach to SPHE, which has again been rolling out in schools in Ireland, in secondary initially, but primary is getting a whole new curriculum, in fact, which will include well-being, which is a sort of primary equivalent. So there are definitely concerns there, but that is balanced with what I mentioned earlier, that you have got in Ireland quite strong protections in the law for parents' rights. I think it's Article 42 in the Constitution talks about the importance of the family. The importance of marriage, of course, is still there in the Constitution. There's a vote on that a year or two ago. So the state is committed to protect the institution of marriage. So you'd have thought that would mean you have to teach about marriage when you're teaching about relationships, sexual relationships. You ought to be teaching about marriage. To be fair, the curriculum doesn't say that, but schools can do it, and there's a good argument they should be doing it. There's the Education Act 1998, Section 9D in Ireland, that talks about how schools must teach these topics in consultation with parents. So that's a duty there. Now, I think on the ground, this is not always working out in schools, but what's really needed is for parents to speak up. We've got parents' councils, of course, in Ireland, which is one forum for this. Parents might want to get involved in the board of management, or they might just want to make sure that they're getting engaged with schools and making their voice heard, as we were saying before, in a constructive way, not necessarily in an attacking oppositional way, unless that is really the only way of doing it, but trying to have that influence. I often speak to teachers who are really concerned about some of the things they're being asked to teach, and they tell me there's all these parents he knows from, they know from church who are Christians, who are parents of children in the school, who've said nothing. And actually it's often easier for parents to speak out. Their job's not on the line. I mean, teachers ought to be able to speak out without their job being on the line. But obviously teachers have that concern for their employment status which parents don't have. Parents are much freer to speak out. So it really is important for the sake of teachers, in fact, that parents speak out.
And you often find that when one parent speaks up, it gives other parents confidence to speak up as well. So that's often what we found ourselves. I found that in a situation recently, just a case that was a kind of informal inquiry that two parents realised something wasn't quite right in a classroom, and they spoke up and kind of gave them that mutual confidence because they kind of went together and spoke to a teacher about it, and it was resolved easily. So yeah, parents, I think, probably don't realise how much influence they have and how much they can help other parents to be brave. So it does pay to speak up.
And we've had a case not that long ago where somebody had been invited in to talk about some books, and parents heard about it. It hadn't really been explained clearly what these books were about. The parents all came together. They approached the school. The school cancelled the event. And yes, we see this time and time again, that where parents are coming together and often not reacting too quickly and too strongly, but being thoughtful. And when we're able to offer advice, that it gives us a great opportunity to help strengthen whatever case that they're trying to make. There's another case going on where there's a long delay because I think the school's seriously considering what's being put to them, which means that they're taking it seriously, which is good. And
then England. We have got so much going on in England that hopefully we'll have time for it. There's the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. Who wants to tackle that?
Well, I could tackle the home education bit of it, if you like.
From your personal experience,
well, yes. This is the thing. The days have changed when it was as easy as just home educating your children, getting on with it. So things are going to change now because of what's happened with the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. So even as this is being recorded, there's a debate taking place today in the House of Commons that is the consideration of the Lords amendments that were proposed and agreed during the bill's passage through the House of Lords. And this, obviously that's going to consider lots of different amendments, but there was a motion to remove a particularly unhelpful amendment proposed by a Conservative peer that would have considerably broadened the local authorities' parameters where they get to overrule parents whose children are in school but they wish to withdraw them to home educate them. Now, those parameters in vetoing parents' decisions to home educate have been relatively narrow, but the amendment would have effectively moved the decision of what's in the best interests of children from parents to local authority officials. But we're kind of hoping that amendment will be removed. And it's good to remember that the Education Act 1996 Section 7 says that the parent of every child of compulsory school age shall cause him to receive efficient full-time education either by regular attendance at school or otherwise, and otherwise is home education. So notice it's parents who are the ones that are responsible in law for their child's education. And obviously we know that's a biblical principle, but it's good to know it's embedded in law as well. And on a more positive note, the government peer and spokesperson for education proposed amendments that have actually led to the removal of some of the worst aspects of the bill that a lot of people were quite worried about, relating to homeschool registers, or more accurately, children not in school registers. So in the original bill, it was proposed that some very, very intrusive measures around information that parents were required to supply would be kept on these home education registers. And the amount of information required has been considerably reduced now compared to what was originally proposed.
And so what was originally proposed, if you're at a sports club for 2 hours a week or something like that, that all had to be recorded? Or?
Yeah.
So it was parents had to declare for how many hours each of them educated each of their children, each of the children that they're home educating, who else was providing any education, what their addresses were, for how many hours they were providing education. And if anything changed, they had to notify the local authority, I think within 15 days. And the register would also contain all sorts of other information on the child, like their protected characteristics, for example. And any other information that the Secretary of State could think of could just be added in. It's been considerably narrowed because that was, apart from anything else, it was entirely impractical. But it was also, it would also be intrusive because it would bring in Sunday schools. You know, if a child's going to Sunday school and they're home educated, the parent has to declare that.
But of course, if you're not home educated and you go to Sunday school,
that's right.
That's
exactly.
not part of it.
And then it also then affects the church that's providing the Sunday school, because if they've got all school educated children, they aren't not under any duty of disclosure. As soon as one home educated child starts attending, suddenly they would have a duty to then provide information to the local authority on request. So a lot of that's been cut back. It's still a concern. It's still not where ideally we'd want it to be.
It's not ideal.
But it's certainly a lot better than it would have been.
Yeah.
Well, one question that we had is, so the CI has kind of opposed this register on the basis that it's overly bureaucratic and intrusive and all of this. But we've been asked, why has the CI opposed a home education register when it could keep vulnerable children safe?
You see, this is the big question. Will it keep vulnerable children safe? Having children on a register doesn't necessarily keep a child safe. It's what happens with the information is the issue. And I think most people would agree that social services are under a great deal of strain with their current workload, never mind having to look at wider issues. So the big question is, would a home school register actually keep vulnerable children safe? And we doubt that.
There've been, of course, some high-profile cases where some children have been treated appallingly, and that they have been used as the motivation for pushing the homeschool register. But actually, I think, am I right in saying that in all of these cases, these children were all known to social services already, and so the home education register wouldn't do anything at all?
Yeah, I mean, this is the case. It's certainly the tragic case of Sarah Sharif. That has been used. This bill was announced on the day, I think, of the judgment in the criminal case there, as if this is the government's response. But she was already on the lists of social services. So having a name on yet another list is not necessarily going to help. Local authority was informed that she was being home educated. As is the case, any child in England who's withdrawn from school, the school is under a duty to notify the local authority. So the local authority already has the name on a list, so it's just putting the name on another list. What's needed is for social services to take action with the information they already have, and that's what's been the problem in the majority of these cases. Now, I mean, we don't necessarily know about every single case, but again and again and again, where these cases come up in the media and it's noted, well, this child was home educated and was then abused, but actually then in almost all of those cases that are in the public domain anyway, the child's name was already on a list. It was on the list of children who were at risk or social services had concerns about. So just having their name on another list doesn't help. It's the ability to use that information and take action. And as Alison says, there are real problems for social services there. They have a huge workload for an individual social worker. And that's at least in part, I think, as a consequence of social breakdown, family breakdown, is often behind a lot of these cases. I'm not saying, obviously, that family breakdown inevitably leads to abuse, but it's certainly a major factor if you look at the statistics and compare family structures and look at where children are being abused. And that sort of abandonment of marriage across society is leading to children, more and more children being at risk, which means then the safety net of social services is having to pick up more and more of that, and that's a real issue.
Yeah, so there's no kind of one size fits all approach, no one thing which is going to kind of make everything better, and it certainly isn't that a new register is going to solve all of these problems. I'm conscious that we've been talking for a very long time and there's still so much to cover. So let's move on and talk about plans for religious education being part of the national curriculum in England.
Okay, so remember the 5th of November. So this was the day last year in 2025 that the Francis report came out, and it was a review of curriculum across England. Within that, it highlighted the fact that there was a lot of inconsistency in RE provision, and that although there was a lot of high quality RE happening in some schools, it was very tokenistic, very poor in other schools. This was, to be honest, this is something I think anybody who is in the world of RE knew. The report essentially said that RE is valued, and it's important that children in England receive high quality RE. They recommended that RE be put onto the national curriculum, but this is not going to be a quick process, because there's a lot of different groups involved. You have schools of religious character, you have faith groups, you have secular groups, you have different organizations that are all going to want to input into this, and different specialists. So it requires a staged approach, which is already underway. It's led by Dr. Vanessa Ogden. They're looking to find consensus, and the government has said that this will only go forward if there is consensus. However, I think
it's going to be tough to get consensus between the Christian groups and the secular groups, isn't it?
I think there's a reality that if they have the appearance of consensus, they could go forward with it. I don't think they're going to struggle to get real consensus unless they fully and properly engage with everybody. There is definitely division in the world of RE about the approach that this curriculum should take. So the Francis report recommended that the REC, which is the Religious Education Council, they have something that was called I'm just going to have to check it, the National Content Standard. And this has been suggested by the report to be kind of like the cornerstone upon which the RE curriculum could be built. But we have to understand that this is an organisation that is supported quite strongly by Humanist UK. They promote a worldviews approach. They're significantly linked to two other major organisations, which is the National Association of Teachers of RE, NATRE, and also the St Cullum's, or St Cullum's Gabriel, or St Gabriel Cullum's Trust. I always get that mixed up. These three organisations, they've been very influential in the world of RE. And I think many people within RE would appreciate what they've done. However, they are all linked. They're all promoting a worldviews approach, which risks undermining the integrity of the subject because it's moving away from its sort of theological and philosophical roots. This is a concern, because what you will find if you were to get this approach is a sort of sociological curriculum wherein it's not really religious education as we know it. It's becoming a way of talking about what are people's worldviews and asking the students their worldviews. But this could very much just degenerate into, just looking at people's opinions without any real substance, and actually really undermining the sincere faiths of people in this country by seeing religion as a kind of sociological construct, as opposed to something that's like the lived experience of many, many people. So it's important that if this consultation is going to go forward, that they really do engage with, what are the roots of this subject? And fundamentally, education as a whole has its roots in theological kind of universities going back hundreds of years. So it is something that it's important to be aware of, to engage in. As I say, the consultation process is going forward. Things have been said that would suggest that RE could become something akin to a bit of, a bit of citizenship, a bit of personal development, a bit of social moral education, and a way of kind of trying to promote social cohesion and a way of trying to nation build. These are some of the terms that have been mentioned, and talking about how we can make a stronger nation with regard to, uniting everyone with these values. But, we've got to ask ourselves, well, what values are we talking about? What are these British values? And I think this has always been an ambiguous area when people talk about British values. There is reference that Christianity is the backdrop for the country, and it informs understanding the nation. You cannot get away from understanding Britain and how we've developed as a nation, or the United Kingdom, sorry, without understanding Christianity. But the worry is, with all the influence coming from some of these other groups, that is very much undermined. We get a lot of non-religious belief in there, which can include lots of things that have got no real relevance to religious education. And what we're left with is really, some worldviews being pushed, and religion and philosophy and theology, subjects that have real integrity and really are very critical and objective if done properly and well and engaging, just getting lost. So these are the concerns, and why this is an important area. I think nobody argues that RE shouldn't be in the national curriculum, or it will benefit from being in the national curriculum. But what that curriculum looks like, it will have a big impact.
Well, I would disagree with you on that. I think there are certainly some people who think that religion just should not be taught at all in schools, and would, fight for that to be the case.
Yes, I mean, you're right, and I think our concern is that what some groups within the sector are promoting would essentially be, it might have, like, how do I put this without sounding too flippant, but kind of, what do you think, with the kind of sort of Buddha image planted on it, and really taking out any of the sort of depth and value and meaning to the subject. And its idea, the worldview perspective, is to start by asking the pupil, so what do you think about God, and what do you think about this? And this sounds lovely, but there's a reality that to be able to properly have a discourse about these concepts, there's a lot of vocabulary, there's a lot of understanding, there's a lot of concepts that children, just to be able to discuss it well, they need that kind of academic rigor that you get by studying philosophy and theology. And then that enables them to really grasp these concepts they're talking about. Just asking them what they think. Trust me, as a teacher of RE for many years, these lessons are going to be very dry and very empty. And it'll be like in a Western when you see the tumbleweed going by. So you need to give them something to grapple with. You can't understand. And we can't get away from the fact that if you don't believe in God, well, that is still a belief. And if you don't believe in God, well, what is the God, or who is the God that you don't believe in? You need to be able to grapple with those attributes of God and the difference between, even within the Abrahamic faith, you've got different conceptions of God. If you want to understand about right and wrong, well, is that grounded in God being the standard for good? And then if we're talking about ethics and right and wrong, and if from a non-belief section, okay, well, you've got to find a different grounding. So even God is the pivot for all these discussions about human worth, human value, the universe, how we understand the universe, all these areas. So without doing it properly and well with academic rigor based upon theology and philosophy, it's just going to become tokenistic. It's going to become very dry. It's not going to have any real value, but it could be used as a vehicle to promote certain ideas that we think will get everyone doing what we want. That's my biggest fear, is that that's what it's going to turn into. How can we teach everyone to be good citizens according to our version of whatever that looks like?
Then we've also got the new RSHE guidance. David, what's that involve?
Well, I think we need to focus on the positives in the guidance. I think other groups will be maybe looking at different areas, but if we were to look at this as a whole, it's coming into effect on the 1st September. So we're in a great opportunity for people to get involved in trying to make sure that the schools are revising their RSE policies so that what they're producing has more integrity, as we previously sort of talked about. But the real positives that came out of it are a greater emphasis on transparency, engagement, and openness with parents. Schools must proactively engage and consult parents. RSHC should be age and stage appropriate and not alarm pupils. Schools should ensure parents are aware of sex education content within lessons in advance. All resources need to be available to parents upon request. This should significantly eradicate the whole issue of secret sex education with regard to parents being denied resources. That should not happen anymore. Any contractual issues, it's been made clear in the guidance, these are void and unenforceable. Relationships education should be clearly differentiated from sex education. This is another big issue where often sex education was being disguised as relationships education. Parents only have the right to withdraw from sex education, not relationships education. The government had made it clear when this was debated several years ago that relationships education was only going to be on things that we'd all agree with about getting along with each other and all this. Now, that hasn't been the case. So as far as we're concerned, if it contains sex, it's sex education. So that should be easier for parents to be able to withdraw their children from if they're not happy about what's being taught. Also, we have things like schools being asked to be cautious about the organisations they're inviting in, to make sure that they've looked at resources, that parents have had a chance to look at resources, so that, especially with reference to if they have any links to any kind of strong partisan view about a contested issue. We've got other areas that significantly pupils should be taught the facts and the law about biological sex and gender reassignment, that schools should not teach this fact that all people have a gender identity. Schools should not be using simplistic materials that are aimed at young children. With regard to cartoons, we have things like the genderbread person being a classic example. These kinds of materials shouldn't be used in schools at all. And significantly, and this I suppose links to the guidance that's also been, which is under consultation at the moment, but this idea that schools should be mindful to avoid any suggestion that social transition is a simple solution to feelings of distress or discomfort, which is very significant with regard to situations where schools were suggesting this or supporting children to socially transition to a different gender other than their biological sex in schools, often without parents' knowledge. And finally, last but not least, that all schools may teach faith perspectives on all these topics in RSHC where they're relevant, so long as they make it known that this is a religious belief. But that's what should really be happening and should have been happening already to ensure that the teaching is critical and objective about some of these very sensitive issues.
So Christian schools have the right to be able to say, okay, well, this is sex education, this is relationships education, this is what the curriculum says, but from a Christian viewpoint, this is what we believe.
As long as they're saying, Christianity teaches with regard to, say, sexual ethics, if you could talk about what Christianity teaches, you could talk about what other faiths teach, so long as you're making it clear that this is a faith perspective, and then also talk about other perspectives. At no point should anybody really be promoting any kind of political perspective on these. So, for example, sex positivity has been a real concern. If you look at a lot of the materials where there was really a promotion, it felt or seemed or came across in many schools' materials that they were almost arguably, or in some cases actually, putting these ideas or promoting this idea of going out and being sexually active as something that it's fine, it's okay so long as there's consent. This is an ideological position as well, a very messy ideological position. But again, this would be an example. This shouldn't be promoted to students. There should be always an objective, critical aspect to these very sensitive areas, especially where they deal with areas where whether you're a religious family or not, you don't need to be a family with faith to have significant concerns about some of these areas. So,
yeah, and in terms of what you were saying before, Angus, I mean, it's not just Christian schools; it's all schools. Should be including where they're teaching as part of RSE issues which are contentious, where people have different views. They should be fairly giving those different views, and that should certainly include a Christian view. So it's not only Christian schools; it's all schools should be doing that. And the thing with this new RSHE guidance is, of course, because schools are now preparing to implement this from this coming September, they're having to revise their RSHE policies, and the law requires them to consult parents before they do that. So this is really a key opportunity now for parents to be looking out for that consultation, maybe even asking the school what its plans are for consultation, and saying their bit as part of that consultation, because that really will make a difference to what the school will do.
And probably the biggest thing to be talked about recently in the world of education in England, at any rate, is this new trans guidance that is, it was originally going to be guidance all on its own. It's now being folded into keeping children safe in education. But we'd been waiting for it. It's finally been released. What does it say?
Oh, well. So this guidance is statutory. So in other words, schools must have regard to this guidance. It's been inserted into a section which is called gender questioning children, but it's also commonly known as trans guidance. And what it's saying is, well, it's saying some useful things in parts. It's saying that it's now categorical that pupils should not use the toilets, PE changing rooms and residential accommodation of the opposite sex. And that is very sensible and helpful, and it certainly will keep children safer in schools, because in the past there were situations where children were being socially transitioned in schools behind their parents' backs, as David has pointed out. And now it's absolutely clear that if there's a child in that situation, then they would not be using the toilets of the opposite biological sex. The one problem, though, is that the draft guidance just simply hasn't gone far enough. It should have been absolutely categorical that social transitioning of pupils in school settings should be prohibited. It should be banned. And it would have brought a lot of clarity to schools if it had been. But what the draft guidance does do is it emphasises that decisions on transitioning shouldn't be made without the involvement of parents, and full social transition should happen very rarely. So there are good aspects, but it could have gone a lot further.
I think what's confused a lot of people is that the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson,
Yes.
The guidance gets announced, and then about 3 weeks later, she comes out and makes some comments about what uniforms people should be able to wear, and just totally undermines everything about the social transitioning.
Yeah, so that was an article, I think it was in the Daily Mail and the Telegraph, where Bridget Phillipson said on LBC radio, if a boy wants to wear dresses in school, we should just allow that to work. So that wasn't really a very helpful statement, and it really undermines what the new draft guidance has said, that it should be a very rare thing in schools, particularly primary schools, that social transitioning should be taking place. That absolutely schools should not initiate social transitioning in a school setting, but it would have been so much better if the guidance had come out and categorically said, no, we're not going to do this in schools. It would have brought a lot of clarity to schools.
But we're saying would have, of course, here. This is only draft, isn't it? So
That's
it's
right,
out for
it's
consultation.
draft, yes.
So there is an opportunity for people to respond to that consultation and
Yeah.
push for it to be clearer.
Yeah, parents, teachers and governors should all be replying to this consultation. We're preparing our CI response as well.
And when does this consultation close?
The 22nd of April of this year. So yeah, it's really important that people do respond to this consultation. They can have a say, which is really good.
Yes, it can be a Christian influence in this secular world, which is sort of the CI motto.
Yeah.
I've kept all of you far too long. You've got so much to do, and so I thank you all enormously for the time that you've given up to chat, and I hope everyone who's been listening, everyone who has been watching, has found this informative and helpful, and empowered to actually go out there and make a difference in the world of education if you can. So a big thank you to everyone who's been watching. If you have any questions for us, remember to email in faithinaction@christian.org.uk and we will endeavour to answer them in later podcasts. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. For more great content, like, subscribe and hit the notification bell.